Well, hi everyone. I'm Alyssa Baum, President of the League of Women Voters of Scarsdale. I welcome you to our fall speaker event. It's so nice to see old and new people here today. I do want to apologize that one of our speakers, Lori Bertram Roberts, will not be here today. She was in a minor traffic accident and sends her apologies. She's doing okay, and we hope maybe to bring her back via Zoom for a spring event. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge some of the people in the room. We have Village Trustee Karen Brew. Also, I'm delighted. Yeah, and she used to be a board member, and we're so glad that she's gone on to bigger and better things. We have Judy Gornstein, who's the current president of the New York State League. And we have some past presidents as well. We have Leah Debitzer and Janiak, and Evelyn Stock, who was president of the Scarsdale, Westchester, and New York Leagues. I'm glad to have her. And lastly, I just want to recognize my outstanding league board who are here today: Diane Baylor, Heedun Chung, Dahlia Khan, Ann Lyons, Dana Matsushita, Debbie Miller, Dick Shub-Mudbury, Kit Rosenthal, Erica Rudlin, and Jenny Tabak, Tracy Tang, and Jessica Zellner. It's such a privilege to work with you all. You're such a talented, dedicated group of women. The League of Women Voters of Scarsdale is a volunteer, nonpartisan political organization which promotes political responsibility through informed and active participation in government. The League is nonpartisan in that we do not support or oppose candidates for public office. It is political in that we take positions on issues after careful study and consensus. We are fully committed in practice and principle to the National League's policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for those of you who are less familiar with the League and what we do, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we are up to. We provide voting information for the entire community and answer questions when people are having trouble. We have candidate forums so people can see the candidates running for office. We follow our local nonpartisan election system and school and village budgets. We have a very strong youth engagement program, and we hold a mock election in the Scarsdale Middle School where kids vote on what's on their parents' ballots. And over the past few years, we've been working with New Rochelle League to visit schools all across Westchester to help educate them on voting and register them to vote. And one of the things we have done this year is we designed a slideshow about the mechanics of voting. We've given it to the kids to make it their own so they can talk about the issues they care about and why they think voting is important. And we'll be returning to those schools in the spring. So if there's anyone who would like to help volunteer or help support us, we welcome you to join the League. And now, for the reason you're all here, the state of reproductive choice for women after the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Although the outcome of Dobbs was by no means a surprise, the formal announcement of the decision was still a reality check for many of us. And it appears that this decision was not popular with the voters either, who have been motivated to turn out in blue states and in red states alike to protect abortion rights, from Kansas to Kentucky to Michigan. So now that Roe has been overturned, where are we now? And is there anything we can do going forward to protect the rights of women and families to have the freedom of self-determination? We are so fortunate to have Rabia Muqaddam, a senior attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights, here today to explain how she views the legal landscape, as well as what we can do and what should be done. Ms. Muqaddam has worked at the Center for Reproductive Rights, headquartered in New York, since 2017. She is lead counsel in the challenges to the abortion bans and restrictions passed by the Oklahoma legislature in 2021 and 22. She previously worked as a litigation associate at Deckard LLP. Rabia holds a JD from Cornell Law School, where she was a president of the Cornell Law Students for Reproductive Justice, an online editor for the Cornell Law Review, and a participant in the LGBT clinical programs. She also holds a BA from Cornell University. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Scarsdale, it's my privilege to welcome Rabia Muqaddam.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. Hi, good morning. As Alyssa mentioned, my name is Rabia Muqaddam. I'm really excited to be speaking with you this morning. It's always a privilege to be in the company of a large room of powerful women. And so I've really been looking forward to this. So I first wanted to give an overview of what I'm hoping to do today. One of the things is to talk about what access to abortion has looked like over the last few years, what's happening now, and also talk about the legal framework that existed going into Dobbs, and what are the legal levers that we intend to use going forward. And then I'd also like to leave you with hopefully some hope and optimism about the many actions that people like you are taking around the country, and why I at least feel like we are going to win, and that the arc of justice does bend, and it will in our direction. And so as difficult as things are right now, and as hopeless as they seem, we're not giving up, you're not giving up, and I think that we will come out and hopefully develop a broader understanding of individual liberty that includes not just the right to abortion, but the right to procreative autonomy, the right to have children in sustainable environments, and all the other aspects of autonomy that we at the center hope to build upon. So I first wanted to talk about reproductive health, rights, and justice. So reproductive health is the full scope and panoply of medical care, all the knowledge that we've gained, all the research that scientists have been developing in this area. And that research and that expertise has demonstrated some things conclusively. One, an abortion is absolutely essential for people's economic and personal dignity and autonomy. When people are denied access to abortion, they experience greater degrees of poverty, abuse, they lose their control over their education, over their jobs. And these are all things we know and have known for many decades, but research has now conclusively shown this in a variety of ways. And then second, this research has shown us that abortion is incredibly safe, that many medical advancements have happened, including the development of medication abortion, which is a 2-drug regimen available in early pregnancy and is as safe as Advil and Tylenol. And that has greatly improved reproductive health. And also that research has shown that that there are all kinds of aspects about reproductive health care that have been so stigmatized, and that stigma in and of itself causes a great degree of harm. And reproductive rights is how we, and I as a lawyer, think about the legal protections that exist to safeguard access to this reproductive health care. But reproductive justice is a term that was coined by Black women, in some ways in an answer to the language of choice that was dominant around Roe and continues to be dominant. But reproductive justice recognizes liberty beyond access to abortion, the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And essential to this concept of reproductive justice is centering those most affected. And those are Black and brown people living on low incomes. So the important thing I think that I like to open with, speaking about access to abortion, is leading into Dobbs, 75% of the people who accessed abortion were living under 200% of the poverty line. That is incredibly, incredibly impoverished. And so access to abortion did remain for many women in this country, but many women in this country were also already living in a post-Roe reality because of lack of access to resources. And while we knew that Roe would fall, and Roe was an essential and important legal protection for access to abortion, the center and our partners hope that in building back up to a concept of liberty, we do it so that it's broader, that it's not just about choice, but it's about reproductive autonomy in all its ways, the ability to have a safe pregnancy, the ability to send your children to safe schools, the ability to decide not to have children, and the ability to make full use of society's opportunities in a way that in some ways the language of choice didn't sort of support as much. And so I think that I am very hopeful that as we move forward and build up a new right, a new concept of liberty, that we do so with recognition that it's not just about access to abortion, it's about access to maternal health care. And this is in some ways an opportunity to really interrogate what we had before and to build something better. So I'm going to talk now about the legal framework. First of all, Roe was not egregiously wrong, as Alito called it. Roe recognized that deciding whether and when to have children is part of an implied privacy right. And essentially what Roe said was, if people can't control when and whether they have children, they cannot exist in a full state of liberty and equality. That when you are forced to carry to term, you're not able to access the full scope of liberty and opportunity that exists in this country. And as a result, access to abortion is essential and a sort of precursor to full economic liberty and full personal autonomy for women. And Roe was grounded in a number of also not egregiously wrong decisions. For example, Griswold, which protected the right to contraception for married couples. Eisenstadt, which was a decision a few years later, which extended that right to non-married persons. And the decisions go on. So we have the decision about same-sex marriage, same-sex couples, additional cases on the right to procreate, so the right to have children. And so there's this incredibly broad tree of decisions in which the court looked at the importance of particular things as a way to express liberty. And so Roe was a kind of natural progression of our understanding that if people don't have the privacy to determine these decisions for themselves, they're not truly free, they're not truly autonomous. And so by banning abortion and making it inaccessible, we are relegating women and other people who become pregnant to second-class citizenship. So what happened in Dobbs? Dobbs, unlike Roe, is egregiously wrong. In Dobbs, the court articulated a very, very, very narrow and frightening idea of liberty. So in the Constitution, the federal Constitution, we have the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says that there are certain aspects of liberty that cannot be trespassed on by the government. And that component of the Constitution has long been interpreted to have what we call a substantive aspect, meaning that it extends to affirmative rights, and that the Supreme Court has said that it is the ultimate arbiter as to what those rights can be and the scope of this protection. And that substantive quality is how the Supreme Court has extended these rights in Griswold, Eisenstadt, Roe, Lawrence versus Texas, Obergefell, all of these kinds of decisions that come out of the court interpreting the Constitution and articulating or delineating the scope of this liberty and what it includes. So there has long been a debate among Supreme Court justices between versions of a conservative view of the law, which is called originalism or textualism, versus what other people call living constitutionalists. So Justice Ginsburg was a living constitutionalist. Alito is one of the most extreme versions of an originalist that we have ever seen, frankly. And so what happened in Dobbs is that Alito articulated a vision for interpreting the 14th Amendment that is incredibly narrow. And effectively what he said is, the only thing that matters is whether a right under the 14th Amendment was deeply rooted in history and tradition. So Justice Ginsburg wrote before her passing that when we articulate rights, when we look at the substantive due process clause in the 14th Amendment, we do think about whether a right is deeply rooted in history and tradition, but we also think about whether it's implicit in our concept of ordered liberty. And so that implicit in our concept of ordered liberty is the analysis that looks at the practical effect of a particular restriction on a right, what it means to people to be able to access it, what are the ramifications when they can't access it. But if you only look at whether something is deeply rooted in history and tradition, you're going to miss those practical effects. And those practical effects are not relevant to whether a right exists or doesn't exist. So what Alito is doing is basically saying that second part, whether something is implicit in our concept of ordered liberty, is completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether abortion bans harm women. It doesn't matter if it subjects them to second-class citizenship. The only thing that matters is whether it was deeply rooted in history and tradition in his mind. And what Alito thinks of as history and tradition is the contemporaneous history of the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So let's think about that for a second. That means that if a right wasn't recognized in the late 1800s, it doesn't exist. This is a version of originalism that is even further to the right than Justice Scalia. So think about what that could mean. Same-sex marriage, contraception, all of these rights were not deeply rooted in history and tradition in the way that Alito articulates. And so Alito goes through a very rudimentary historical analysis that is deeply flawed. But he basically says, well, in Roe, they looked at all this history and they said there's nothing in history and tradition that forecloses a right to abortion. But I think that history was, in any event, wrong. I think there is history and tradition around that time that demonstrates that a right to abortion is not deeply rooted in history and tradition. And there's a footnote in the decision in Dobbs where Alito says, no, don't worry. This isn't going to affect marriage liberty. This isn't going to affect contraception. It's not going to affect interracial marriage. But the reasoning of the decision would undermine all of those rights, which is acknowledged in Justice Thomas's concurrence, in which he said, I don't even think there is a substantive due process protection in the 14th Amendment. And for that matter, I think this is a made-up thing. And so if this is a made-up thing, we're coming after Griswold, we're coming after Obergefell, and notably, he did not mention Loving versus Virginia, but they're coming after Loving versus Virginia. So what we have here is a Supreme Court membership that has circumscribed our idea of liberty so narrowly that it basically means that we are living in a world where the only people who have true access to liberty are white men, frankly. And so that's why the decision is so dangerous, even beyond our understanding of the right to abortion. And, unfortunately, following Roe was an articulation of abortion access as a fundamental right. And because it was a fundamental right, it was subject to what we call strict scrutiny, meaning that the government has to meet the most exacting standard in order to trespass on it. And it said that up to viability, the state's interest in potential life, whatever it may be, is not strong enough to support a ban on abortion. But following Roe, there were a number of decisions as the anti-choice movement continued to chip away at Roe. And so leading into Dobbs, we had already lost quite a lot of the substance of the right to abortion. So in 1992, the Supreme Court bumped us down from strict scrutiny to what we call intermediate scrutiny. That was called the undue burden standard. And they basically said, we think Roe undercounted the state's interest in potential life. But that opened the door for states to enact all manner of restrictions on abortion, justified whether it was women's health or potential life. And then following Whole Woman's Health and June Medical, the analysis also became more challenging for rights advocates to meet. In particular, in June Medical, which was the last case before Dobbs that was litigated by us on behalf of our clients, June Medical Services, Roberts had sort of articulated in a concurrence something that was even narrower than the undue burden standard. And for very annoying doctrinal reasons, we faced arguments that Roberts's concurrence was actually the governing legal standard. All of that, mumbo jumbo, is to say that leading into Dobbs, we had lost many, many layers of the right to abortion that was originally articulated in Roe. So Dobbs is the first time that the Supreme Court has ever taken away a liberty right. It has articulated a right, it has refused to articulate a right, but it has never taken one away. And as we've seen in the midterms recently, this has had a cataclysmic effect on the lives and health of women, the people who love them, their families, and it is motivating people to come out and vote. But again, I think the really important thing to remember about abortion care today is that the people who need to access it are those typically living in the most vulnerable circumstances. And this is one of the big results of Dobbs, is that we are now living in a place where you can access some rights in some states and not in other states. And to be clear, the research that I was talking about earlier has just continued to show what was recognized in Roe, that even whatever you think about what was going on around the ratification of the 14th Amendment, access to abortion is essential for people's dignity, for their ability to take advantage of life's opportunity, and their ability to care for their existing families. So what's happening on the ground? It's really bad. So we at the center represent what we call independent abortion providers. Independent abortion providers are those basically that are not Planned Parenthood. We, as a group that litigates on behalf of these independent clinics, partner with Planned Parenthood, with the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, the Lawyering Project, and other organizations to litigate on behalf of these clinics. We knew that Dobbs was coming, and we knew it was likely to be very bad, and the only reason for that is the change in the composition of the court. It's as simple as that, as they garnered enough votes that thought that Roe was wrong. And they overturned it, not because they had to. There was no reason for them to take this case from Mississippi under all the traditional ideas about why the Supreme Court takes cases. The Supreme Court's supposed to take cases that are implicating a circuit split or causing, great irreparable harm, or a recognition that a right does need to be articulated, for example, but never to take away something that has been recognized as a liberty right. And the only reason to do it is because they thought it was wrong. So the courts, unfortunately, even beyond the Supreme Court, have been heavily shifted by Trump appointees. And we consider really any judge that was appointed before Trump to be relatively favorable to us, in the sense that they will do us the courtesy of applying the law. That is not true of many Trump appointees who are really, ideologues. And so we face very steep challenges in the courts and did before Dobbs. But now that there is no federal right, we really don't have a viable path forward in many states. So one of the cases that I worked on before Dobbs was a case in Tennessee which challenged what we called a cascading ban, which was an idea that they came up with that was like, the ban goes at 24 weeks, but if that's held unconstitutional, then it's 22 weeks. And if that's held unconstitutional, then it's 20 weeks. And then it went all the way down to 6 weeks. And then it also banned abortion on the basis of a diagnosis of Down syndrome or the potential for Down syndrome. So that could mean like an early genetic screening. So for those of you who have had children may be familiar with how early and how inconclusive that kind of testing can be. So I argued this case before the Sixth Circuit, and we won. And they basically said, this is clearly unconstitutional under Roe. Under Roe, you cannot ban abortion prior to viability for any reason. And although the state might articulate some interests, the right needs to exist in some way. Following Dobbs, we had to dismiss that case, and we lost our injunction. And that's because the basis for the decision, and the decisions in many of our cases, came down to Roe. And so without that federal right, we don't have a path forward in a lot of states. Tennessee is one of 13 states that currently ban abortion entirely. And after Dobbs, we filed a slew of emergency litigation in a number of states because most of those states had what we call trigger bans, meaning that they immediately banned abortion after Dobbs, or that they banned abortion within 30 days of the Supreme Court's judgment. And some of that litigation has been successful. So I will emphasize that in Kentucky yesterday, there was an argument before the Supreme Court of Kentucky asking the court to articulate a state constitutional right to abortion. That argument went very well. And in my cases in Oklahoma, I have argued to the court there that there is a state constitutional right to abortion under the Oklahoma Constitution. And so there's going to continue to be a lot of litigation under state constitutions. And the important thing to remember about state constitutions is the federal constitution is the floor. And so states cannot intrude on liberty below that, but they can provide greater protections. And many of the states, and including many of the Western states, designed their constitutions to be better than the federal constitution. So some of the framers of the Oklahoma Constitution, for example, described a desire to make their constitution progressive, something that could grow. And they also included, many state constitutions include something beyond due process. So some of them include something similar to the 14th Amendment, but many, including Oklahoma, North Dakota, and a number of other states, Kansas, they include something called inherent rights clauses. So if you remember from history class, John Locke, these are also called Lockean clauses. And they basically are an affirmative grant of right. So most of our constitutions, state and federal, they're negative rights constitutions. An inherent rights clause does something that says, not only are the government cannot trespass on things that are reserved to the people, but the people have this affirmative natural liberty. And so around the country, we are arguing that these types of clauses and other aspects of state constitutions protect the right to abortion. We saw it in Kansas. We succeeded there in a case the center brought. We succeeded in Montana. We hope our partners will succeed in Kentucky. I hope we will succeed in Oklahoma. We don't know if all of these courts will meet the moment, but because Dobbs is egregiously wrong, we hope that the state courts will at least step in to articulate some level of rational thinking about whether or not the practical realities actually matter to people's liberties. But the reality is that many states will see abortion bans in effect for quite some time. And so our second hope, and ultimately our great hope, is something called the Women's Health Protection Act. So the Women's Health Protection Act is a federal law that would, in line with what I was talking about in the beginning, enshrine abortion rights in federal law, but it would also enshrine right to prenatal care, postnatal care, contraception, and sort of this full panoply of rights that we know are so important to people's dignity. And so that law is not going to pass this year. It passed the House this year, which was huge. It's not going to pass this year. It's not going to pass next year. And it may not pass without removing the filibuster. But that bill is growing in support every day, in part because of the dramatic things we're seeing on the ground. And that is ultimately where we need to be, a federal law that protects all the aspects of reproductive health care that we know are so important. And we also need to support advocates and funding for people who are accessing care and practical support. And to be honest, there are going to be people engaging in civil disobedience, because as we did before Roe, communities helped people get access to abortion care, and we're going to need to facilitate that happening now as well, especially because the people who are affected by these laws are the most vulnerable among us. And unfortunately, we anticipate that states will continue to enact more legislation. They're not going to be done with abortion bans. We're seeing that they're going to try and ban travel out of state for abortion care. They're considering gag rules that would prevent people in banned states from talking about abortion or referring or helping people get out of state. And so we will be bringing federal litigation against those laws because, as is probably apparent, they violate all sorts of other parts of the Constitution. And so there will be litigation in the federal courts around those issues. But people in banned states are continuing to show up for their communities. They are the wonderful speaker that you unfortunately aren't going to hear today, Lori Bertram Roberts, is an activist, and she is developing practical support, funding support, travel support, and providing additional midwifery and pregnancy care where possible. And lots of advocates all across the South are doing everything they can to shift opinion and to grow political power for choice advocates. So what is happening now on the ground is pretty catastrophic. There's no real way to get around that. Abortion is basically the same as miscarriage care. And so abortion bans are affecting people who are seeking abortion, but they're also affecting people in medical emergencies who have been assaulted. They're affecting people who have high-risk pregnancies, fetal diagnoses. And they are undermining reproductive health care generally. Doctors are struggling to provide the care that they've been trained to provide. Doctors are afraid to provide obstetrical and gynecological care in these banned states. Residents, medical students don't want to go to these areas. And all of these states, to a T, if they're banning abortion, they also fail to support contraception, sex ed, prenatal care, postnatal care, maternal mortality. There are states that really have abdicated their responsibility to preserve the health and safety of people who become pregnant in their state. And so this is another aspect of why it is so important for our reproductive rights framework to expand to a reproductive justice or broader framework that includes all of these different aspects of reproductive health. And we have an opportunity to do that now. And partly it's because I think a lot of people in this country didn't recognize, probably present company excluded, did not realize how this would affect maternal health care, maternal mortality. They didn't realize that it would affect miscarriage care. But we're facing the horrific reality of people being unable to access abortion and all of these other aspects of healthcare. And there were already extreme deserts of reproductive healthcare access in the country. So we're going to build it back up. We're going to do so via using state constitutions. We're going to pursue federal legislation. We're going to pursue state legislation where possible on wedge issues, for example, medical emergencies, and exceptions for people who've been assaulted. And so although abortion will remain illegal in many of these states, we are going to do everything we can to build back up a right to abortion, but also a right to these broader healthcare issues. Because it's one thing to be able to access abortion, but it's another thing to be able to have true reproductive autonomy. And that includes being able to have children safely and to be able to raise those children in safe communities. So in terms of what to support, what do we do with our resources? What do we do with our time and energy? I think one of our biggest failings as a movement is shifting resources away from the states. And unfortunately, that meant that advocates on the ground were typically underfunded and didn't get the kind of support that they needed to build up progressive movements in the states. And so I encourage you to look for local abortion funds who are providing practical support. There are funds in Texas and Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, which is very close to my heart, since that's one of my main states, there's something called the Roe Fund. They could use your support, but there are tons of organizations in the South that could use your support, including the Mississippi Reproductive Health Fund, which is run by Lori Bertram Roberts, who hopefully you will hear from in the future. And, you know, we're going to win. We're going to win for a few reasons. One is the law is on our side. The law doesn't recognize only the rights from late 1800s. I mean, that's perverse and absurd. And so if this Supreme Court majority is going to come for our rights on this basis, they will fail because it is contrary to the way the law has been understood for generations, including in the 1800s. And so I do not believe that they will ultimately win on the law once the courts become more rational and, again, do us the courtesy of applying the law. And this is going to embarrass my mom, but she's not here, so she doesn't know. My mom has always felt that the right to abortion should have been understood as an equal protection right, which was an argument we made in Roe. And that argument is women cannot be equal if they don't have access to abortion and other reproductive health care. And so I say that to say that there are wonderful aspects to our Constitution, things that have allowed this country to grow in its understanding of equality, rights, dignity. And although Dobbs has been an incredible blow, we will continue to exploit every aspect of the Constitution to build back this right. And we'll be doing it in the state courts too. And hopefully Congress will ultimately pass the Women's Health Protection Act. And in the interim, advocacy groups and funds on the ground in the South will be helping everybody they can to get abortion care. So I'll just say that it has been my great privilege to represent abortion providers in this country. They are the most resilient and amazing people that I've ever met. And they're not going to stop too. And so many of our clinics have moved into border states and are continuing to provide care and to help patients as much as they can. And so you can also find, there are also funds to help clinics open up in border states. So it is a dark time, undoubtedly, but we were already sort of in a dark time because Roe had been so sliced away bit by bit by bit. And so now, looking forward, I hope that we will build back a much better and broader right to abortion, to healthcare generally, because we know that women without these supports or these services cannot really be free. They can't really have full autonomy. So I imagine folks may have some questions, so I'm going to conclude it there. Well, I'll say one other thing. Gen Z. I think and a really important thing to remember is every generation of Americans is more progressive, is more openly identifying as LGBTQ+, is more concerned about climate change, is more concerned about violence, and more concerned about reproductive health. And we saw that on Tuesday in the midterms. Oh God, that was last week, somewhere. Last week, Tuesday. And those people came out and voted. And to be honest, they are a huge reason that we did not see the bloodbath that some of us were expecting. And that's another reason why I'm hopeful, because they're a much better generation than mine, for sure. They care more, they're more interested, they're more knowledgeable. And so I think that these anti-choice, so-called pro-life people are facing their own extinction. And that is another reason why I think we have cause for great hope. And now I will go for questions. Yeah?
Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara Crane. I live in New Rochelle. I had a career in international abortion rights, which you didn't mention, and I applaud your presentation and the work that CRR has done around the world, as well as here in this country. I wanted to mention a couple of things very quickly and ask a question of you. I recently met some people in Washington that are working on a legal strategy around the FDA and access to mifepristone, called the Health Access Fund.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably familiar with it. They are hoping to raise large amounts of money. If there's people in this audience who have deep pockets or have access to wealth, they need money to pursue this legal strategy in a number of states, and I wondered if you'd like to comment on that. I also wanted to mention that the Westchester Women's Agenda is an important network in our county, and there's a reproductive justice working group in the Westchester Women's Agenda if anyone is interested in being part of the sort of ongoing network concerned with these issues.
Thank you for bringing up medication abortion in a more detailed way than I covered initially. Medication abortion is, again, extremely safe and huge, huge scientific advancement. So it is incredibly simple, straightforward, safe. Basically, you take a drug called mifepristone, which stops the pregnancy from growing, and then you take misoprostol, which expels the pregnancy. This is something people can do at home. They don't even have to go to a clinic to do it. And unsurprisingly, the so-called pro-life forced birth movement has done everything they can to limit access to this safe medication. And they've tried basically all manner of ways, including trying to ban medication abortion, limit it to certain insane, circumstances. In an Oklahoma case we won about 6 years ago, the state tried to basically ban all abortion-inducing drugs, which also happened to intrude on treatment for ectopic pregnancies and miscarriages. It was a really bizarre law. So medication abortion is a huge advancement, and there are lots of organizations that are working to get these pills in the hands of people who need them. So one of the best advancements has been since Roe. So I was talking to some folks earlier about one of our clients who shared their abortion story at our gala, and she talked about having to get into a car with her dad, be blindfolded, go to a garage where there were grease stains on the floor and there were women waiting, and she was provided an abortion in a really unsafe environment. And fortunately, a doctor called her in some antibiotics, But if she hadn't had those antibiotics, they discovered later when she gave birth to her children, she might not have ever been able to give birth to her children. That is fortunately not necessarily going to be the reality for people accessing abortion outside of the medical environment because medication abortion is so safe. But they're coming for it. And so organizations like that are working with the FDA to remove medically unnecessary restrictions. And there are also folks working to get those pills into banned states. Aid Access, Plan C, Honeybee, these are organizations that have sprung up to try and mail and get medication to people who need it. Unfortunately, it is legally fraught because these bans, they're designed to come after people who are self-inducing or self-managing an abortion too. Some of the states' bans exclude the pregnant person from liability, but not all of them do. However, medication abortion is life-saving, and it is the best hope we have to get abortion care in the hands of people in the South. So I heartily echo the recommendation to also look at organizations who support access to medication abortion, because those are folks who are going to be getting abortion care access into the hands of folks in the South. I might actually talk about one other thing you mentioned, which was international abortion access. So the center has lots of human rights lawyers who do amazing work in the courts. They do it in Geneva, in the Inter-American Court in Latin America. They do it in the African Human Rights Court. And they've achieved amazing victories in the last few years. Amazing, in countries you would never expect. Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Kenya, and Ireland, and the list goes on. And so I think that demonstrates that this movement is going to change and become something different. But that again, we will be we are on the right side of history, that people really are understanding this as a healthcare issue. And we look at these other communities in the world, and we and Poland and Hungary are really in this small minority of countries that are moving backwards, but so many countries are moving forward, and they're doing it in incredible ways with broad coalitions. So, we will get there again. And like I said earlier, the Roe was not enough. Roe was not enough. It was never enough. And so I hope that we will take a cue from the amazing movements in all of those countries to build a new right.
Is there anything that the pro-life movement can do to remove abortion access from states like Kansas that voted to make it part of, they made it part of their constitution, I believe, it was constitutional. I mean, is there any way that we should be protecting states that already have abortion access in them? I mean, is that a real concern, especially border states in pro-life areas?
So in Kansas, Montana, and some other states, the state Supreme Courts in those states articulated a fundamental right under the state constitution. And so there's only really one way that the state government could come after that right, and it's through a ballot initiative. And so they tried these ballot initiatives to strip that right out of their state law, and they epically failed. And I think they will continue to epically fail, because what we have known for quite some time is that fairly large majorities in this country support access to abortion, at least in some circumstances, and people are not going along with these very, very draconian laws. However, that ballot initiative process goes both ways, I would say. So we, as people who live in a blue state and in other states where we protect access, we should be supporting ballot initiatives to enshrine abortion rights in our state constitution, like they did in Michigan, and like what happened in California and Vermont. Illinois passed something called the Reproductive Health Freedom Act, which took effect a couple of years ago, that does a similar thing, protects the right to abortion under state law. And so I do believe that these ballot initiatives will continue to fail in the South. However, when they are proposed, counteracting those ballot initiatives, those anti-choice ballot initiatives, requires a lot of resources. And so if those spring up, that's another place that can use resources. Those campaigns are very resource intensive, but I think they will continue to fail, because if they're failing in Kentucky, they're going to fail. And so I think that we will continue to see those ballot initiatives fail. But I do hope we will continue to see proactive ballot initiatives, because there's room to grow in a lot of states, including in New York. There is room to grow in terms of access to abortion, contraception, protecting people's access to reproductive health care generally, including birthing care. And so I definitely hope that we will see more and more of those. And there is, an aspect of this that is particularly frightening, which is a national abortion ban, which we know that many, many Republicans support, including Senator Lindsey Graham, who introduced a 15-week abortion ban before the midterms. Thank you, Lindsey Graham. And guess what? People are not fans of that either. But that is their goal. The goal is ban abortion entirely for everyone, no matter the circumstances, no matter the health risks, no matter what it means for them personally. So we will have to continue to be vigilant on the federal level, and we will do so and continue to advocate for the Women's Health Protection Act, which would be, so much more than Roe. So I do believe that will ultimately pass, but we're going to have a pretty steep uphill battle against so-called pro-life people in the federal legislature. Yeah.
Where does the church stand on all of this?
Interesting question.
The various churches, actually.
The various, yes. So I was just telling Alyssa that we've actually been working with a lot of clergy. I grew up in a multi-faith household with a lot of different kinds of traditions, and but I was confirmed in a Presbyterian church, which fortunately was a nice church where we treat people with dignity, and you can get married no matter who you love, things like that. That is not most churches in the South. But there are tons of religious leaders who are really getting mobilized right now. And as some may recall, there was a huge movement before Roe of people of faith helping patients get out of states so that they could get abortions. And in many ways, leading up to Roe, people of faith and faith leaders were really at the forefront of helping people get access. And they've been less activated since Roe, but I think folks are really getting mobilized now. So we've had faith leaders file amicus briefs in the Supreme Court. I had a group of clergy file an amicus brief in my Oklahoma case. And I just participated in a workshop for clergy in Oklahoma to educate them about reproductive health. And they're chomping at the bit to get involved and to help. And I think that shows that so many people come to this issue from a place of faith, deep conviction in the ethical and moral agency of women and individuals. And so I'm really excited that people of faith are getting super energized about this issue. And it's definitely been educational for me. The rabbis that joined the brief in Oklahoma talked about the texts that exist in their traditions, that talk about the preeminence of the life of the mother. There are aspects of Unitarian churches that have kind of institutional statements about reproductive health. So I think that the communities of faith are going to continue to get more activated. And I really think they just has such a great counterpoint to this idea that abortion is immoral. The people of faith see abortion as immoral. That's just not true. People of faith, many of them, are drawn to this work because of their belief. So I hope that will continue to be a really growing movement.
And is there an argument that my religion does not prohibit this, therefore you can't, people make the argument, I'm not baking this cake for a lesbian couple because my religion prohibits it. Well, how is that not the same argument that could be made here?
So a very unfortunate thing that has happened in the Supreme Court, in addition to all the other horrible things, is that the Supreme Court has shrunk one aspect of religious liberty in this country and greatly expanded the other. So we have in our religious freedom doctrine a component that is called establishment. That's the Establishment Clause, and that prevents the government from establishing religion. And for many, many generations, it was interpreted as sort of preventing, for example, most state funding for religious schools, or preventing, the federal or state purse from being used to foster, facilitate, or establish a religion. And then there is the other side, which is freedom to express one's religion. And what this Supreme Court has done is made the Establishment Clause basically toothless, and it's made the other part incredibly robust. And so they've said things like, you know, if you're a regular commercial business, you can refuse to serve people on the basis of your religion. If you're Hobby Lobby, you can refuse to provide contraception for the people you employ, even though you are a commercial entity. And so it has posed a really big barrier to asserting, hey, the government is doing something based on a religion that is not mine. And it's really hamstrung those kinds of arguments. That said, there are absolutely arguments to be made because we know that these anti-choice forced birth laws are predicated on one view of morality and typically one view of Christianity specifically. And I've watched a lot of hearings in state legislatures, and invariably they talk about this is what we have to do as people of faith, this is what God is directing us to do. So the Establishment Clause should have a role in preventing the enacting of legislation that is driven by a religious view, but it unfortunately has not worked out that way because the clause has become so toothless. However, there are people of faith who are working on bringing those claims. It's a challenge because even under the Establishment Clause, if it existed in its former glory, it sort of extends to the right of the religious community and their congregation. So it's difficult to use an Establishment Clause claim, for example, to get what we would call facial relief, which means an entire law struck down. The more sort of typical relief would be, okay, as to your religious exercise, you congregation and your congregants, this law is unconstitutional and cannot intrude upon what you want to do. So it's definitely a challenge for both the legal standard and also the relief that those communities can seek. However, we at the center and many other organizations are thinking very deeply about these claims because they're another aspect of the Constitution, another lever that we can use. And there are some cases that have been filed by synagogues. There's unfortunately a whole slew of cases that have been filed by the Satanic Temple, which, to be frank, doesn't raise a super strong claim. It's much stronger claim on behalf of rabbis and synagogues, for example, because as I mentioned, they have components in their religious texts that talk about this issue. For example, a Unitarian Church, similarly, the United Church of Christ, has a statement about reproductive health. Those are stronger bases to say, you know, hey, this is intruding upon my religion's view of reproductive health. And so I continue to look forward to working on those claims, and I think that we will see them brought in some form. It's a challenging claim, though, because the Supreme Court has undercut this argument quite a lot for obvious reasons. You know, they're interested in people using religion as a cudgel to strip away the rights of others. The idea that a commercial business can decline to serve you because they don't agree with your identity is now something we accept because the Supreme Court has issued decision after decision saying that. But it's really unacceptable and also completely out of line with how we've understood religious liberty in this country for the 200 and some years leading up to these kinds of cases. Yeah?
Along those lines, isn't there a group in Florida, a synagogue group that has a case? I don't know where that case is at this moment.
Yes, that's one of the cases that's been filed by a synagogue. I think there's two at the moment. The case in Florida, I think it suffers from this challenge about relief. I don't think that through that case they could get the law struck in its entirety. But I think it certainly serves an important goal of rebutting this idea in the public and in the courts that religion is anti-abortion, which just isn't the case. Even if it mattered, right, whether somebody has a religious belief against abortion, even that if that could be used to strip rights from somebody else, it's just not the case that religions are unified on this issue. And many religions, including Jewish traditions, including Christian traditions, including Islamic traditions, are not anti-abortion. Rather, they prioritize the moral agency of the person who's pregnant.
And the last question is, what was the law that was passed in Kentucky?
So in Kentucky, they actually don't have a state right to abortion, but a case brought by our colleagues at the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project on behalf of EMW, which is the only clinic left in Kentucky, they are making this argument that I made in Oklahoma, that the state constitution of Kentucky protects the right to abortion. And they're doing it based on, again, the state constitution being on its face broader than the federal constitution. And there is a significant chance that they will win. And for that reason, the state legislature was like, we need to do something to forestall this happening. And so they tried to use a ballot initiative to prevent the Supreme Court from issuing any kind of decision that would protect abortion access, and it failed. And so we now have a shot at, if the Supreme Court agrees with ACLU's arguments, which I watched the argument yesterday. It was the lawyer from the ACLU of Kentucky did an incredible job, and the court definitely appeared inclined to issue some kind of decision, at least preventing the abortion ban from continuing. And so now we have a real shot. Like, if that right is articulated by the court, that will restart abortion access in Kentucky, which would be incredible.
I thought it passed on the ballot.
No, it passed to say that you can't, it was like a double negative
Yeah.
initiative that basically people voted to say you can't deny us abortion. It was kind of like the opposite effect.
So there were 6 ballot initiatives regarding abortion. Some of them were what we call proactive, like in California, Michigan, Vermont, that said we want to protect abortion access. There were also a couple that were anti, and that's what Kentucky's ballot initiative was. It said nothing in this constitution, Kentucky's constitution, protects the right to abortion. And so if it had passed, it would have prevented the state Supreme Court from issuing a decision like we got in Kansas or Montana. And it would have basically prevented the court from protecting abortion at all. Because they would have had to say, well, our state just passed a constitutional amendment that prevents us from doing this, so we can't do it. But now, because they didn't enact that ballot initiative, there is a shot for the court to do what we hope it will do and say that there's protection under the state constitution.
So don't you think because these anti have passed ballot initiatives, that in the states that were thinking about having them on a ballot next year, they would not, because it brings out, it like causes the reverse of what they want to have?
I think we're going to see fewer of them because they're clearly not succeeding, right? They're not succeeding. And so now if we, for example, get a great decision from the Kentucky Supreme Court, the legislature will be seriously hamstrung in doing anything about it. And so I do expect that we're going to see fewer and fewer. I read an interesting op-ed. I usually read his op-eds to kind of get an idea of like what the other side is thinking. I think his name is Henry Olson in the Washington Post. And he wrote an op-ed yesterday saying, yikes, like we need to reevaluate how our anti-abortion movement goes forward because people are not pleased with what is happening. Surprise. You know, polls before Dobbs showed that 60% of Americans would not agree with the decision overturning Roe. And he was sort of saying, maybe we should actually do something to help people and their families. Like maybe we should be making contraception easier to access, or maybe we should, you know, be making it easier to be a parent. Which, you know, reproductive health advocates have been arguing for decades. Like, if you want people to parent, expand Medicaid. Give them prenatal care. Address your maternal mortality crisis. Don't take away this important reproductive health care access. Just make it easier to be a mom, to be a dad, to be a parent, to be a sister. And so I do think they're kind of having a come to Jesus moment, is really on the nose, but like a moment where they're like, oh wait, maybe we've gone too far. Like, yes, banning abortion entirely is going too far for anyone, really. So I do think that they're kind of recognizing that if they continue down this extreme path, I mean, we're seeing abortion bans with no exceptions. You know, like the poor patient in Ohio was a 10-year-old. I mean, we know what pregnancy does to a 10-year-old's body. It's not safe. And she had to travel out of state to get care. People are deeply upset about not only losing access to abortion, but all the ways that this has just really undermined the health of their communities. So I think that they will probably pull back from some ballot initiatives. But to be frank, it's not really like them. You know, these people, once Roe was decided, they engaged in a decades-long campaign to have it overturned, and they were successful in large part because they do whatever it is that they think is necessary, and that included passing incredibly draconian bills even under Roe. So I am not super confident that the forced birth movement is going to course correct. I'm also not confident that the Republican Party is going to course correct, despite all of the things that have happened, both in terms of abortion, ballot initiatives, and also in terms of just the general political rejection of extremism. But I hope that at least in some places, we will see people meaningfully grapple with what abortion bans mean, which is incredibly bad public health in your state. That affects the most marginalized people.
Yeah, could you explain, I haven't been following it that closely, where we are in New York? Do you foresee a ballot initiative coming to proactively enshrine it in our Constitution?
So we have legislation that protects access to abortion. I definitely think a hope is that we would do a constitutional amendment, and I think the hope is that we will do constitutional amendments in a lot of different places. But fortunately, that law, it's similar in Illinois. They also have legislation, not a constitutional amendment. But these laws have significant protections for access to abortion. What I would hope that we do in the future in the state and others is expand that to prenatal and postnatal care, to contraception in a broader way than we do now. I think a huge aspect of what reproductive justice focuses on, and not as much reproductive rights, is the ability to have safe pregnancies. And I would like to see in New York a bigger commitment, not just to abortion and contraception, but to making it a lot safer to carry pregnancies, and especially for those who don't have resources. So I'm hoping that when we do that, it's going to be a really broad, wonderful amendment that protects this whole panoply of rights.
Okay. What is the status of aiding and abetting laws? Are a lot of states enacting them, and has there been litigation about them? And is there anything that safe haven states can do to counteract their effect?
So one of the earliest indicators that Dobbs was going to be catastrophic was SB 8 in Texas. And SB 8 is the genius idea. Kagan called it the idea of some genius. That some genius is Jonathan Mitchell. He was the Solicitor General of Texas and is an all-around nightmare. And he has been shopping around this idea of basically eliminating a constitutional right without eliminating a constitutional right. And what SB 8 is it was designed to be impossible to challenge in court. And so when you bring a challenge in court, you need to meet a few requirements. You need to have standing, the court has to have certain types of jurisdiction over the dispute, and you need to be harmed by the law, and you need to have the ability for your harm to be addressed by the court. I'm just gonna put that up there. Okay. And so SB 8 basically, because it was designed to be enforced through these bounty hunter lawsuits, it was extremely difficult for us to challenge because we couldn't sue anyone. We didn't have defendants to sue who enforced the law. And as a result, we didn't meet those jurisdictional requirements. So, we brought out, my colleague Mark led a lawsuit in Texas that went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, we don't really think we can rule on this because of these difficult jurisdictional questions. And they let it take effect, knowing that the effect was a ban at 6 weeks. And after that, we started to see the proliferation of these laws. One of them, the only other one that's in effect, is in Oklahoma. And we similarly had a situation where that ban took effect even before Dobbs. And so those laws have not only prohibit giving an abortion, having an abortion, but aiding and abetting, as you point out. Aiding and abetting is not really clear what it includes. It's clear that it includes financial support. Oklahoma's law explicitly says financial support. It could apply to your grandmother who drives you to the clinic. It could apply to almost anyone, and almost anyone can file a suit. So in Texas, for example, we had a client, the wonderful Dr. Braid, who violated SB8 in order to create awareness, really, that this law was chilling conduct. And he got sued by somebody from Louisiana. He got sued by somebody in Illinois. And he got sued by somebody in Texas. And those cases are ongoing. So, they're really preposterous laws. The most dangerous thing about them in our current reality is that they could affect travel between states. So what the blue states have done in many cases is enact something called a shield law. And to be frank, I don't really know what they're going to do because our system is not designed to have criminal laws or any other laws reach into other states. The last example, I think, that is sort of analogous are fugitive slave laws. So, what we're worried the states will do is try to use aiding and abetting laws, but also their own criminal laws to reach into other states and say, you can't provide an abortion to our citizen, or if you help somebody travel out of state, you're aiding and abetting. Fortunately, we have not yet seen any prosecutions under those theories, but we're certainly worried that in the new sessions, we're gonna see these types of travel bans, and we're gonna see them with this aiding and abetting provision. So as of yet, we haven't had indication that the current laws are gonna be enforced against travel in that way. But certainly that was, I think, one of the goals of including this aiding and abetting language. In Oklahoma, we think, and the Attorney General issued a guidance that says, as long as the abortion is not unlawful, then you're not aiding and abetting an unlawful abortion. So that provided some comfort that if you help your friend get out of state, or you are providing someone money to get an abortion in a haven state, that you're not violating the law. But these laws are designed to be confusing, and they're designed to chill conduct. And so even in Oklahoma, even though the Attorney General has now said, only if it's unlawful, I'm hearing that people are sending miscarriage patients home from the ER until there's no fetal cardiac activity. They are psychiatrists getting policies from their organizations that require them to say, I'm so sorry, due to a recent law in Oklahoma, I cannot talk to you about abortion. We're hearing that there's forced pregnancy tests to make sure that somebody who comes in with abdominal pain, for example, is not someone who had an abortion. And we're hearing about ectopic pregnancies and people who have been raped really being denied care, even though ectopic is quite clearly not an abortion and exempted expressly in the law. So even though these laws haven't been enforced in that way, or people haven't brought suits about people helping people get out of state, I think that it's something that's on the forefront. But again, we would bring challenges to those laws under a few things. The right to travel, which is another constitutional protection, a very dusty doctrine called the Dormant Commerce Clause, which, if you went to law school, you probably remember from all the, river cases, such and such grain ship is going on our side of the river and such like that. So that doctrine, in theory, says that you can't do certain things that intrude on interstate commerce, but we would also perhaps bring claims under these shield laws. But shield laws are relatively untested, and they raise a lot of novel questions. So I think that we will see litigation that kind of ultimately articulates the boundaries of those protections. But even, those laws cannot reach into a banned state and make something legal that is not legal. We hope, however, that they will protect providers in blue states and provide them comfort to provide abortions to banned state patients, because there's just a lot of fear. And that's affecting providers in blue states too, especially those who have, for example, maybe they practice across banned states and haven states. Maybe they are part of an interstate compact, for example, nurse practitioners. many of them belong to multi-state licensure compacts, and so they're licensed both in a banned state or in a haven state. But I hope that those laws will ultimately serve some function in terms of protecting people's licensure and giving them comfort. But we don't quite know yet. Yeah.
I'm just curious because, I have a daughter about to head to college, and among my friends, a question that has come up over the last year is, would you consider sending your daughter to a school in a state that is banned? I'm just curious, like when you talk about, periods in history where there have been migrations based on, whether it's economic or, civil rights injustices, is there a chance that we'll start to see with this Gen Z generation, people, if they can, migrating out of these banned states, or where do we see population growth, almost to create these sort of, desert areas where people won't choose to live?
I think that's absolutely right, especially for people who have children. I mean, this is an incredibly life or death personal issue, I think, whether you are a person who becomes pregnant or are a parent to someone who does. And it's not just access to abortion that is being threatened in these places. People with trans children are becoming political refugees because their children can't get the health care that they need in Florida or other states. And so I do think that we are going to see people with resources leaving the South. And in some ways that will be really harmful because we need folks on the ground to push back against these legislatures. And it's going to take time because of the gerrymandering and the institutionalizing of conservative politics there. But I think a lot of people will stay and fight. Many of the people that we work with are advocacy groups. My lead plaintiff in Oklahoma is called Oklahoma Call for Reproductive Justice. They're local folks who, they're not going anywhere. But it is an incredibly frightening time, especially for people who have children, because, I mean, God forbid your daughter or someone's child can't get something that they need. It's a horrific reality. And as much as sort of companies have come out, some companies have come out and said, we'll help you, we'll ensure that you can access, or your families can access. It's frightening, I think, the prospect of living in a place where if you go to the hospital and you're having a miscarriage, you may get really, really subpar medical care. And I do think we're going to see people moving. I mean, they're basically, I think political refugees is kind of the right term, especially, I don't know, any kind of people who are being stigmatized right now. Trans kids is one of the most horrific examples because we know that gender affirming care is life-saving, and people who are trans need that care so that they don't commit suicide. They're at high risk for mental health concerns, abuse. So that's another form of life-saving care that is being denied to children. And so I do think we're going to see movement, but as you point out, not everybody's going to be able to. So it's going to be, I mean, it's a little like in some ways when we had white flight, right? Like a lot of people left those communities, but it left those communities with less resources, and much of that has developed and changed over time. But it's definitely a concern, especially for doctors, teachers, and other people who these southern states desperately need. They have shortages of OBGYNs, they have a shortage of hospitalists, they have a shortage of family medicine doctors, shortage of teachers, because teachers don't want to teach in a community where they're afraid either to talk to somebody about a student who raises something like contraception, who wants to talk about gender identity. So I definitely think it's a serious concern. Yeah.
What can we do here in New York, other than write checks or move?
I really think the biggest thing is speak loudly and publicly about this issue. One of the biggest things, and of course give money, as you point out, to local folks in the South, to abortion funds, and campaigns, ballot initiative campaigns. I think really unfortunate thing is that abortion became stigmatized, and not just in the South. It became something that we didn't talk loudly and proudly about. And I would hope that that is something that we can all do, is talk about abortion access, talk about what it means to people to have an abortion. I was recently talking to a family member who I don't look forward to talking to ever again, who said, well, it's not in the Constitution. It doesn't say it in the Constitution. And I was like, well, it doesn't say interracial marriage in the Constitution either, but do you think we should be running around stopping people from marrying somebody because of their race? And he was like, ooh. But talk about why it is that abortion is essential. And I think that there is also, we've allowed men to be absent from this conversation. And it is my great hope that men and other people will talk about why this is important and push back against the idea that people of faith don't support abortion, push back against the idea that men don't have a role in this discussion, push back against the idea that safe sex ed for our children is key and important and that contraception is essential, and talk about why these things are incredibly, incredibly important and really a matter of life and death. And so I do think that every person can talk about these questions in a more open manner, and that will, I think, move the needle ultimately, because abortion is not something to be shoved under the rug. It's not immoral, it's not unethical. It is a form of healthcare that many, many people in this country need in order to be free. And it's not, I think, something that we talk about enough, especially in communities where it's protected. But I hope that if we all contribute to that discussion, it will ultimately change minds, honestly, change minds. And so what I said to that family member is, I was like, imagine for a moment, do we have to close? Imagine for a moment you are your daughter and you're in college and you get pregnant. Just imagine what it would be like to have to be forced to give birth. You're 19, maybe you have to stop your education. It changes your whole life. It upends your whole life plan, and it tethers you, and the government is essentially taking away your independence and autonomy. That's why abortion is essential. That's why Roe existed. Not because abortion on its own is a right necessarily, but because access to it is essential for us to be free. And I think that is something that I hope we can all talk about more openly. And I will say that as much as I feel like I live in a bubble in New York, I have encountered many people in my life who I wouldn't believe would be as ignorant of the effects of these types of laws and about what reproductive health care is, about what pregnancy is like. And I think we saw that in New York State, right, with people and the way that people are voting. And maybe it's because they don't feel like their votes, their rights are on the line. But I think it's also because of communities not really talking about these issues openly. And I mean, so many of the people who propose these laws in the South, they don't know anything about pregnancy. Nothing. And I'm like, you are parents. You are parents. Most of them are men, but like, pregnancy is for many people beautiful and joyous, but it is also a burden and intense and harmful, and it has effects on your body and your mind and also like your ability to live life. And so when it's an unintended pregnancy, it just has all of these effects that make you less free. But I don't think there's a real understanding of that. But the more we talk about it and the more we destigmatize it in our communities, I think it moves the needle and it shifts minds. I think one of the most important examples of this, going back to the international context, is what's happening in Latin America. These are incredibly Catholic countries, but the movement has succeeded in making abortion in people's minds part of health, part of healthcare access. And I think that's really something that we can learn from, is talking about this, destigmatizing it, and making clear why it's so important.
I moved here from Texas just a few months ago, just husband's work, and I'm going back here next week for Thanksgiving. I want to share talking notes or talking points about this conversation. What's a good resource for me too? Because what you laid out that I didn't know was how many other rights are integrated within just abortion rights that could be taken away. And I would like to be able to present that picture as well to family members with different views.
Yes, sure. So she was asking about whether there are talking points or materials that might be helpful in talking to our families or other folks who may not agree with us about why these things are so essential. So on the Center for Reproductive Rights website, there are materials to speak about abortion and contraception. The other thing I would refer you to is an organization called We Testify, which is an abortion storytelling organization. And on their website, WETESTIFY, you can see an amicus brief that was filed in our most recent case with stories from people about why abortion is so essential. I think that's a really interesting thing to share with folks because it includes tons of different kinds of stories. You know, I went to law school because of my abortion. I had my future children because of my abortion. I had my abortion because my life was on the line. I had an abortion because if I had given birth, my child would have suffered and died within 10 minutes. And those are the kind of stories I think people don't really think about when they think about abortion. They think about not wanting to be pregnant, but abortion is so much more than that. And so I think that might be helpful. And then I think the other organization that I think really speaks well about the public health implications is if you go on the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists website, they have a number of materials about why abortion care is so important to healthcare and public health. What was the name of the last organization you said? American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG.
And what is the name of your organization?
My organization is the Center for Reproductive Rights.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Rabia, for coming today. I'm really just in awe of your knowledge of the law, your ability to explain it to us, your dedication, the incredible creativity to meet this challenge. It will be a long road, but thank you so much for coming today. And I also appreciate everyone who came, both league members and non-league members. I hope you learned something, and we welcome you to continue and join us on our next event. Thank you so much.